so much. Next we have Radhika Balakrishnan, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership and also the U.S. Human Rights Network Board Chair. And Radhika, if you could talk about how CEDAW ratification would affect the social and economic rights of women and economic justice more broadly, that would be terrific. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll stand up as well. I want to start by giving a specific example, which I actually wasn't going to until Charlotte mentioned. I was part of a team of 5 people who did the first pilot of how to implement CEDAW in the city of San Francisco when this city passed CEDAW as a local ordinance. And we were given the job of having to implement CEDAW in 2 city departments, Public Works and Juvenile Justice. And I can tell you, when we walked into the Public Works Department and they just looked at us and said, CEDAW? What does that have to do with us in building roads? And what was amazing in that process is to show how it did have something to do with building roads. And I'll give you 2 concrete examples from my memory of doing this project. One was to talk to them about the kind of lighting they had in city parks, right? And where the telephones were in relation to the lights. And it seems like a simple thing, but we talked to the Public Works Department, and they put in, and we went to Montreal, we went to different places to look for examples of where they've done these kind of things. And I remember 2 years later talking to some colleagues of mine in San Francisco and talking about a park where nobody went to after dark. And after this implementation, it was full of families with kids after dark playing. And so CEDAW has something very real. I mean, it's about giving public spaces back to women and families. And so I can give you many more examples. But what I really wanted to talk about is what CEDAW has to do with economic policy. And a couple of examples of what CEDAW has to do with economic policy. I'm drawing on the work of a colleague of mine, Diane Elson, who's done work on budgeting and CEDAW. Not specifically on the U.S., but I think UNIFEM has it on their website and has reports on it, and I highly recommend any of you interested in it to look at it, and also drawing on the work that Diane and I have been doing in macro policy. So one of the things that you could use CEDAW for is to look at our fiscal policy, how we spend money and how we tax, right? You don't think of sort of CEDAW and stimulus money and expenditure policy and tax policy, but CEDAW has a huge amount of relevance to the kind of economic and macroeconomic policies that we have. And so I want to give you 2 very concrete examples for the economic policies that are being done right now. I mean, I can talk about other ones, but 2 in terms of the response to the crisis. I have to say that when President Obama talked about, in his State of the Union address, the cutting of spending that was going to take place starting 2011, I was incredibly disappointed with the categories that he said was not going to be cut and the categories that were going to be cut. And what does CEDAW have to do with that? Well, it has to do with recognizing that when spending gets cut from healthcare, education, state and local budgets that are being demolished, who takes on that work? It's not as though when you cut healthcare and education, people just sort of go in a corner and crawl up and die. There's an incredible elasticity of women's work called the unpaid work that women do that takes on that work. And so there's an assumption about women's lives that are being used in order to cut the spending. So, you know, when he talked about we won't cut military, but we'll cut all of this, it is a discriminatory practice that doesn't allow to understand the impact it has on unpaid work of women. One more concrete example. When we look at the stimulus money and what kind of industries it's going to, how is it helping women's employment? Because one of the things that CEDAW says is that we have the right to non-discrimination in the right to work. And so here we are in a moment of crisis where there's huge levels of unemployment across the country, but where the money is going to, is it helping women's employment? And so I feel so bad. It's one of those things that sticks in your head and you forget where you read it. So whoever said it, I apologize. We talked about Rosie the Riveter. But now it's sort of, if you want stimulus money, you have to be Rosie the Insulator, right? Because that's where the jobs are going. And so how much money is going, for example, into daycare that will give huge numbers of women jobs in the daycare industry and allow a whole group of other women to go join the labor force? I mean, there's very specific ways we can look at CEDAW as a way to affect the macroeconomic policy. And lastly, is that, I've been the chair of the U.S. Human Rights Network and a member, activist in the network. And I have to say the excitement around the CERD process and how we, as the network, galvanize people from grassroots organizations all around the ground, all over the country, to participate in that CERD process, I think ratifying CEDAW will galvanize a different kind of activism coming on women's issues that we haven't seen in the U.S. in a long time. And lastly, I think that when we do this, we need to make sure that the work on CEDAW is not separated from the work on CERD, so that we don't forget that there is a difference between all women, and that we look at both the racial and gender discrimination that takes place in the U.S. So, and the last thing is, we shouldn't stop at CEDAW. We need to pass the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights.